My experience as a Saturn fan during its retail run was extremely positive. It wasn't a second-rate system for me in any way, instead providing many hours of great gaming with some of the most memorable software of the era. Even with that said, there was a load of games that I wanted to come to the system. This episode covers the games I thought for sure would make a Saturn debut in some form. Many of them could have been easily done on the Saturn, while others piqued my curiosity on just how well the Saturn versions may have turned out. A handful of these would go on to the Dreamcast, but the vast majority never made it to a Sega system in any form, with a precious few still locked away in the arcade completely. I hope you guys enjoy Games I Really Wanted on the Sega Saturn. We all have that moment in the hobby where you run across something truly special. It instantly hooks you with its theme, art, visuals, audio, or gameplay, and every once in a while, all of the above. One of those games for me was 1991's WWF WrestleFest from Technos, Japan. I had been a wrestling fan in my youth, and though there had been a handful of decent wrestling games by this point, the truth was that most of the licensed games had been utter and complete garbage. Walking into the arcade and seeing this had completely blown me away. Each character's iconic personality was accurately conveyed on screen. They had their moves, finishers, poses, everything, and it was all wrapped up with little touches like Mean Gene showing up for interviews and play modes straight from the TV shows. You get two choices here. A Royal Rumble that pits you against a load of guys at the same time, and a Tag Team Championship mode where you are out to defeat the legendary Road Warriors for the titles. Playing this again here brought back a ton of memories of how badly I wanted a home version, and it was really the Saturn that was the first system that could have done it any justice. Those huge sprites all on screen at once would have been a no-go on the 16-bit machines of the time, and it was just begging for a roster update and more modes for a home release. We actually wouldn't get that until the iOS release in 2012, but it was the Saturn that I really wanted it on all those years ago. I didn't understand the intricacies of license deals back then, and this one had no real chance of coming home on anything. If you have never played this one and loved wrestling games as a kid, do yourself a favor and fire it up on MAME. With SNK bringing a number of its Neo Geo releases to the Saturn, I was really hoping it'd get one of my favorites from them. Released in 1997, Shock Troopers was an overhead run-and-gun shooter with great graphics and gameplay. I love the setup here. First you get to choose a unique character that has their own speed, life, and special attacks, and then you get to choose which path you want to take to get to the finish of the game. With this one landing in 1997 and likely needing a RAM cartridge to be decent, I knew it had no chance of coming out in the West, but Japan had a real shot, I thought. Of course that never happened, with SNK deciding to give Saturn owners a port of Metal Slug in 1997, another run-and-gun classic itself. There's a ton of ways to play this one nowadays, including modern systems like the Switch, Xbox One, and PS4. It also has a sequel, and while it played good enough, I always preferred this one here. I got a rare treat back in the mid-1990s, and that was being able to play the awesome Data East beat-em-up Night Slashers. It's set in a world overrun by monsters, zombies, and all other manner of nightmarish creatures. It has 3-player co-op, and the gameplay has loads of moves and nuke attacks to help you along the way. It's a great looking game that I thought for sure was coming to the Saturn in Japan. Data East had a number of releases on the Saturn, and even if they didn't publish the game themselves, surely someone else would pick it up in a compilation. It wasn't meant to be, and the Saturn ship would sail without the game entirely. In fact, nothing saw a release of this one, at least not until last year when the Switch got a digital edition of the game. This is both criminally underrated and underplayed by the gamers of its era. If you enjoy the genre and want to play a fine example of how to do it right, look no further than this one here. Perhaps one of the most infuriating things about owning a Saturn back then was the sheer number of Sega's own games that would be bypassed on Saturn. When I saw the AM1 oddity Cool Riders in 1995, I thought for sure that this was going to come to the Saturn. How could it not? It was so different from the stuff AM2 was doing, and Sega needed the variety in its lineup. It also featured the kind of engine the Saturn could excel at, scaling 2D images really fast. The gameplay was bonkers, with crazy vehicles and characters making the already over-the-top scenery that much more appealing. It played a lot like Sega's other great racing game that should have made it to the Saturn, Outrunners, which was no bad thing. This one was rare even when it was first released in the arcade, a reality that perhaps doomed its popularity and thus any chance of a home conversion. Sega sits on a wealth of these type of releases, and if there's any justice in this world, the gaming gods will see that they have their day in the sun eventually. This one should be no stranger to any of you as Saturn fans, not just because it was such a big franchise back then, but also because this was actually officially announced for the Saturn in 1996 by Yu Suzuki himself. My interest in this one wasn't just because I liked Virtua Fighter 3 in the arcade, but also my monumental curiosity of just how Sega planned to pull it off. Moving a game from the Model 3 to the Saturn was going to be no easy task, even for the geniuses at AM2. Magazines at the time began to speak about Sega looking at add-on 3D accelerator cartridges to get the job done, while other options were to just port the game the same way they did Virtua Fighter 2. I was excited to see the outcome no matter which way Sega went, but alas, we'd not see this one make it to a final release. There's media out there that is supposedly unfinished Saturn work, but I doubt the validity of these. The Saturn game likely never got past the planning stages, especially with the Dreamcast development taking off so soon after its announcement. I think Sega made a major mistake rushing the Dreamcast to the Japanese market in 1998, where the Saturn was still alive and kicking. A solid Virtua Fighter 3 release on Saturn could have reinvigorated sales and given Sega another year to work on Dreamcast development, something that could have made a hell of a difference in the long run. I was a big fan of the Real Bout Fatal Fury games on the Saturn, with both releases still some of my favorite fighters for the system. When SNK released Real Bout Fatal Fury 2 The Newcomers in early 1998, I was hopeful that we'd see it get a Saturn version. The first two games had been very decent ports for the Saturn, and SNK had supported the Saturn strong since its beginning. I didn't fully understand at the time what the Dreamcast meant for the Saturn in Japan, however. It didn't matter how well things had gone there for the Saturn up till 1997. Sega was intent on replacing the Saturn platform, and that meant third parties were inevitably going to abandon it. Real Bout Fatal Fury 2 never made it to the Saturn, of course, something that actually prompted me to find and buy my very first MVS cabinet a few years later. This remains a fantastic fighting experience, and is available on the PS2 as well as digital versions on all three modern consoles. In 1994, Capcom released one of the best 2D beat-em-ups I have ever played with Alien.vs. Predator. Its co-op multiplayer and blending of two hot science fiction franchises had been a perfect melting pot of success. It looked good as hell, running on Capcom's trusty CPS2 arcade hardware. When it was announced the following year for the 32X, I was beyond excited to get a home version of it. When that version was cancelled, I thought for sure it was coming home to the Saturn. It was a natural course of development in my mind, and I eagerly awaited its announcement in the gaming magazines. That never came, nor did the game itself, locking this one away in the arcade to this very day. Many mistakenly believe the Activision-released Super Nintendo version with the same name is the same game. It isn't, and the only way to play this Capcom beat-em-up classic is to either find an arcade cabinet in the wild or fire it up via emulation. I highly advise you do so. I fell in love with the original Resident Evil the second I started playing it. The setting, the story, the characters, the atmosphere, everything appealed to me instantly. When Capcom released Part 2 in early 1998, I thought for sure the Saturn was going to get a port of it. Capcom had been a big reason the Saturn was so awesome for me, and they had supported the platform with most of its biggest releases up until that point, including the original Resident Evil. With the Dreamcast coming together in 1998 and the strain of developing a Saturn version, Capcom opted to not bring the game out for the Saturn despite beginning development for it. An eventual Dreamcast release would see the light of day, but this one remains one of my all-time missed games for the Saturn. Had Sega stepped in and helped Capcom with development, this could have been another awesome late-life major release for the platform. Dreamcast was the priority, however, and the Saturn had yet another casualty of Sega pulling the plug in Japan so early. My buddy Sam, the SSG, has a hell of a good video on the subject I highly recommend.
Most of us know the story of RE2, from its rocky development cycle to the plethora of ports that would span 2 console generations, as well as its cult-like status that after 21 years has led to its long-anticipated remake. But one piece of this story is rarely spoken of. While so many gamers had their chance to fight through the horrors of Raccoon City, Saturn fans were left hanging, our only consolation a new game on a piece of hardware yet to even be released. And while others may be content with glossing over this port with its lack of a pre-release build, there's still a long timeline of events and much more to the story than just 2 official statements. With all that said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm the SSG, and this is the history of RE2's failed port for the Sega Saturn.
File this one under another Sega-owned franchise that got shafted during the Saturn era. Released in 1992 for Sega's beast arcade platform, the System 32, Golden Axe: The Revenge of Death Adder was a sequel to the original arcade game Golden Axe. You may have heard me bitch about this one not seeing a home release before, and you are gonna hear it some more here. How this awesome game never saw a Sega Ages release in Japan is still a head-scratcher. I mean, Sega brought out Castle of Illusion and Quackshot for God's sake, but not this? It was a perfect beat-em-up at its core. 4-player co-op, team-up moves, massive sprites, multiple paths to take, incredible special effects. It had everything a great beat-em-up needed, and Sega owned the damn IP. Making things worse, Sega not only left the Saturn without it, but everything else as well. There has never been a home port of this for anything, leaving emulation the only way to play it. Sega Ages on the Switch would make a perfect home for this, finally giving the Sega faithful a way to own it legitimately. My final most wanted Saturn release was 1997's Street Fighter III. I thought this was coming to Saturn for sure. Capcom had already made impressive use of the RAM cartridges for the Saturn, and had released many of its top arcade fighters for the system. the heart of the CPS-3 arcade board that Street Fighter III ran on had also been an SH2 CPU, leading me to believe that a port should be manageable despite the differences in architecture elsewhere. It just seemed such a great fit for the Saturn, and I eagerly anticipated the announcement. Like everything else in this episode, it never came, and Street Fighter wouldn't get a home release until it hit the Dreamcast in 1999. Many in the community loved to debate whether the Saturn was actually capable of delivering a decent port of this. Much of the game would have needed to be torn down and redone to work on the Saturn's architecture, so there no doubt would have been changes in graphics, sound, and even timing of the gameplay. This was the case with many of Capcom's ports to Saturn, but I feel it would have not been anything that couldn't have been adjusted to easily. It would have been a small trade-off to receive a home port of this one nearly a year earlier. Of the games I covered in this episode, it's the games that Sega themselves owned that hurt the most. Something like Revenge of Death Adder was made for Saturn hardware, and to get an announcement for Virtua Fighter 3 and then get nothing at all was a huge disappointment. Most of these casualties no doubt came because developers realized Sega was abandoning the Saturn platform when Dreamcast development began. Even the likes of Capcom and SNK, who supported the Saturn with a bunch of games, would bow out and move on to the brand spanking new Dreamcast. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.